Okay, I'd now like to introduce Paul Hirst.
Right, well, as you can see, I'm adopting an extremely high-risk strategy because I haven't changed my jumper. You're lucky, I've changed my shirt, all right? So, you have to take it on the force of argument. No smarty looks. Okay, now, two points to begin with. This talk is about the relationship between forms of government and space. There's absolutely nothing about buildings. Second thing is that it attempts to deal with the problems of the increasing fragmentation of modern society into competing plural groups, which was mentioned before. Now, my reflections start from Michael Sorkin's Variations on a Theme Park, and I think two positions shared by most of the contributors, and then I want to go on to make some wider arguments. The first of these is really that, I mean, it's not a very, you've heard enough of this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, that the public space of the classical city, its streets, squares, and places, is being threatened and eroded by the privatization of hitherto communal areas by shopping malls, enclosed systems of walkways, and corporate complexes. And ultimately, this threatens the mixing of the different social groups in the city, and it threatens the public sphere, the place of democracy, by the elimination of its spatial contexts. So that's the first position. The second position is that this is in part driven by middle-class fear of the danger of the streets. It amounts to social segregation, because you have special security guards and so on at the walkways and entrances to these complexes, and certain people don't get in. And that we need open spaces where the plural groups of the modern city can meet. So in a sense, the street is a locus of publicity, and I mean that in the old-fashioned sense, that is of public life. All right. Now, that's all fine. I absolutely take the diagnosis. What I want to question is whether we can have the same sort of prescriptions. Now, underlying these positions is the idea that government is based on a political community with a common citizenship. That is, it is self-governing, and all members have a reasonable equality of access. All right? Now, this I would call the ideal of civic republicanism, and it really stretches from ancient Greece and Rome through Renaissance Italy and so on to the present day. And it rests on the related ideas of the public sphere, where all groups meet, and the public space that actualizes it, not merely formally, but in the everyday commerce of social groups. Now, what I want to argue is that in political terms, and I'm by trade a political theorist, so this is what you'll get, the idea of a single self-governing community whose citizens govern their affairs, who interact in public space, is now deeply problematic. Okay? There is no possibility, right, of recreating the polis, right, of having a single citizenry, because actually forms of government, space, and so on are pulling apart. There is no us, there is no demos that can be governed. Okay, and I'll try and show you why this is. Now, citizens flee public space in part through fear of the pathologies of a pluralism beyond control, violent street crime, and the mores of an underclass who have little in common with respectable citizens. Clearly, you can see in phenomena like the Los Angeles riots or conflicts between blacks and Hasids in Brooklyn, there appears to be the fear of a society in process of decomposition and a flight of the respectable from the dangerous streets to the safe shopping malls and suburbs. Now, I think the argument that these fears are exaggerated and flight provokes the very divisions it seeks to respond to are correct. But the ideal of the street as a public place, a public space, as part of a locus of social mixing, rests on this waning idea of a political community. Okay? And I shall try and say why the political community idea is waning. Okay? That is, a single political community that encloses a demos. So firstly, I shall claim that the nation-state and the city as its municipal equivalent, right, as the forms of republican government, are less and less effective loci for a unitary democratic political community. Nation-states are really phenomena that are losing salience in the modern world, particularly because of the internationalization of economic relations. And this limits the capacities for national economic management. Okay? Now, national economic management has been the key, along with war, right, and the conflict of nations, has become the key cement in the 20th century of the location of the idea of the national political community. If you lose capacities of national economic management, if people are less worried in most of the advanced world by enemies and the need to mobilize against them, the nation state becomes less and less of the main point of reference for people. Other loci, other politics become possible. So we find, for example, at the international level, that the international cooperation of nation states, various other agencies, the growth of trade blocs like NAFTA and the EC, and the existence of regulation through specific international agencies have all grown in significance. Right? So you cannot imagine a managed world that is, in a sense, not international. Okay? And those forms of governments are, in a sense, now as important as any other. You cannot locate community somewhere. At the same time, they don't fit together very well. And the degree of management is limited and is always subject to gross slippage. Right? As you can see with things like the ERM, not very pleasant, but that's what the world is like. Okay. Now, if the national level, right, has lost a good deal of primacy, it's not only lost it upwards to the international level, it's lost it, I would say, sideways to the regional level. Right? Because the idea of municipal government of the city is increasingly less and less effective. If you respond to the internationalization, right, of economic affairs, it is through regional economic management, sustaining the supply side of an economy. Right? Why? Because by and large, with the exception of a few cities, it's only regions like, for example, Bavaria or Lombardy, Catalonia, that have the mixture of the tax base, right, the scale of the industrial districts, and the capacities of government to handle those things. Cities are, of course, nodes in regions, but they are no longer sufficient. Right? So the idea of the national republic and the municipal republic as the nodes of governments have gone. Right? They cannot be the nodes. There are several of them, and they're slipping. Now, the point then is that we cannot see, okay, a sovereign and omnicompetent political body, whether it be the city or the nation state. The notion of a nation state as sovereign state is increasingly obsolete. The national level is one of a series of loci of public and private governments that interact in many complex ways. So we're returning to a multi-located political world with complex and overlapping powers of governance. Some are multinational, some are non-state, some are regional, some are national. And this complexity mirrors the sort of slippage and complexity that you had in the High Middle Ages before the emergence of coherent, sovereign, national monarchies. Okay. Now, you can like this or loathe it, but that you've got to take it into account. Right? And it's very bad news, in a sense, for a lot of people who are interested in localizing government in space or in ordering space, because it looks like space is going to be disorderly. Right. Now, I haven't got many answers on that. I want to talk about some other things later which may address that. Now, the second set of problems I want to deal with are that various processes have long since produced the decomposition of the idea of an ethnically and culturally homogeneous society, a demos. Okay. Remember that, in a sense, classical democracy relied on homogeneity. Foreigners did not have political rights in Athens, for example. Only native-born Athenians. Okay. But value and cultural pluralism are far advanced. Right? Now, paradoxically, I want to say that chief among the processes that produce this pluralism, right, is not some sort of fear or growth of community. Right? It's individuation. Right? Because in the end, it's people who choose communities. They choose styles of life, they exploit geographical and social mobility, they identify with chosen communities, but they also leave them with remarkable facility. Right? And the people who don't leave are, in a sense, the underclass, but they have their communities too, and they make their choices. Now, if modern societies are therefore increasingly pluralistic, driven basically by a logic of individuation and individual choice, then there is no single body of citizens who share a common, thick and inclusive definition of the good life. And if societies are individualistic, right, then paradoxically, of course, we find that the groups themselves are rather hollow because people move between groups. Right? Now, this means that we really have to reject the idea of a thick idea of a common society, right, and a rooted idea of a local community. Okay? The city, in that sense, is less and less a place of long-settled residence than a chosen location, one of many stopping points in a social career. Okay? Now, that, again, has to be taken on board. And if my argument, therefore, is that a large part of what is driving what I would call pluralistic communalism is individuation, right? That people pick communities because they embody what they want, they cooperate with others because they like it, then we have to deal with that problem. But how do you deal with it? Well, firstly, by abandoning the view of politics based on settled, relatively homogeneous and stable communities, whether of nation or city. And this is the dominant form of our thinking, right? It's been long obsolete in some sense, but it's the dominant form of our thinking about politics, that the demos is a homogeneous body, right? And your Rousseau is a real problem there. But also the idea that, in a sense, we really live in long-settled societies, right? We don't. And we've got to do something to cope with that. Now, to do so, we need to abandon the model of unitary republican self-government. Okay? We've got to accept that government is complex, it's multi-layered, right? And that any given commonwealth can only be a community in the thin sense and for certain purposes only. Right? And that the city cannot be modelled on, 5th century BC Athens or Renaissance Florence. Right? And if I get the time, one of the things I'll say is that, Ottoman Damascus might be a better starting point at looking at our analysis of where we might go. Okay? And I'll come back to that. Not a very nice idea, perhaps, doesn't sound sort of as good as Athens or something like that. Now, since the mid-19th century, you might say, politics in Europe was organised by a contest between positions on a left-right spectrum. And its fundamental organising principle was a hot or cold social war between capitalism and socialism. Right? There was one big issue, and you could put virtually everybody along that spectrum from left to right. Okay. Now, why was that? Right. The answer is because all those positions were contesting for what they thought was a single and key locus of power, the power of a centralized and sovereign nation state. So they interacted, all of them, by competing in the same political space, hence the possibility of a spectrum, right, of left to right. Now, these organizing structures of politics are fast vanishing. New political forces are too diverse and too concerned with very different and often specific issues to be placed on a single spectrum. The forums in which they seek influence and to obtain decisions are varied and overlapping. The result is, for example, that the idea of the political party as the locus of decision, as the locus of identification, is less and less salient to people. I mean, classic social theory talked about the demos, the deciding demos. Right? A great deal of political theory from the 19th century onwards thought in party-nost terms. Right? It was infected with the idea of party, particularly on the left. Right? But parties are going. Now, my response to these changing structures of politics is to argue that we need new political doctrines and new political objectives. Okay. And these do locate with space, as I try and say in a minute. But if we continue to think in terms of the vanishing world of civic republicanism and its spatial correlates, we shall continue to lament the loss of an old order while doing very little to respond to the new. Okay. Our political theories are fast becoming obsolete in a serious sense. Now, I want to argue three things initially. Firstly, that we must see politics fundamentally in terms of disaggregation between territory and function. Politics will become complexly federal, not merely between different levels of territorial authority, but also between multi-locational forms of functional government, some of which are international, some community-based but interlocational. Right. So we're talking about forms of government which deal with specific functions. They may very well cross boundaries, right, and they may be sited at different points in a city, but never add up to the communal governance of a city. Okay. Now, what that says is there can be no coherent public sphere, right? No single public sphere, and so there can be, in a sense, no public space, no space of meeting and location together. Okay. Now, the second point to make is that part of that complex structure of authority will be the devolution of power to voluntary self-governing associations. Now, classic democratic theory treats voluntary associations as what it calls secondary associations. Okay? They're part of an independent civil society distinct from the state that serve as the foundation for the plural political groups that compete to control the state and therefore ensure democracy. Right? Secondary associations are kind of bedrock of democracy. The argument that Alexis de Tocqueville mounts in Democracy in America, for example. Okay. But modern societies are in a sense not faced predominantly by dictatorship or the tyranny of the majority. They're faced by, on the contrary, overloaded and ineffective national and municipal big governments, which are insufficiently accountable because they rely on democratic political mechanisms that were created in the 18th and 19th centuries for limited government. Okay? We've been relying, in a sense, on the democratic means of accountability that were fine for a night watchman state, right, but not for an omnicompetent public service state. Okay. So we don't fear the tyranny of the majority now. What we fear is the contest of fragmented minorities. Right? But we also fear the domination of civil society by large hierarchical organizations called business corporations. What has happened in the increasing obsolescence of national and municipal government, of the demos and so on, is the growth within civil society, right, of institutions which are hierarchical. Right. We're no longer fearing the dictatorship of the state. Right. Increasingly, we're facing organizations that are dictatorial in civil society. Right. Some corporations, for example, claim such a tyrannical power over the lives of their members that they're an outrage. Okay. We can think of numerous examples of this kind if we want. All right. Now, the division between state and civil society is in crisis. Okay. On the one hand, the state is inadequate to perform its functions and inadequately supervised. On the other, civil society is increasingly, on the one hand, fragmented, and yet to the degree it's not fragmented, it's dominated by forms of hierarchically controlled power that are ultimately answerable to nobody but their masters, not answerable to the shareholders, not answerable to their workers, answerable only to their masters, and their masters are the top officials, who themselves are only answerable ultimately to their stock market quotation. And Buggin's turn for their replacement. Well, if this is the case, if civil society is increasingly incivil because it is filled with contesting groups who really don't recognize the public sphere as much as they did, and by hierarchical government, what do we do about it? Well, I think the answer is that if the state is increasingly less a locus, if government is multifunctional, multi-locational, there is no single one place where we can say, this is the public sphere, then what we must do is to try and reinvigorate civil society as a political agency. Okay. And in order to do that, we must accept a number of things. Firstly, the plurality of civil society, the coexistence of competing community and associational goals that cannot be accommodated within a single state structure of provision. Okay? The usual solution to this Canadian craziness, right, is multiculturalism, right, where you have single social programs that are supposed to please every community, right, and without exception offend each one of them. Right. I always give the example of a friend of mine, Trinidadian. His son comes home from school. He says, "What have you been learning?" Well, he said, "I'm supposed to be learning, things through Jamaican patois." And I tried to say that this didn't have anything very much to do with me and was rather offensive, but I was told to shut up. Right. Now you can see that the idea of a multicultural, single system, a kind of Einheitspluralism through the state, right, is increasingly absurd. Okay? You have to have pluralism for real. Right? But it has to be a pluralism which has government in it. Right. How do you do that? Second point within my second point, okay, that overloaded states must cede functions to publicly financed but voluntary self-governing associations that organize themselves as communities, communities of choice, I emphasize, okay, not of fate, okay. So communities that try and tyrannize their members and don't let them exit are no-no organizations in this thing. Communities of choice. What this means is that civil society must be publicized, using the word in its old term again, right? That is, made political and plural. Right? This is if it is to redress the marginalization of democracy in society and the incapacity of the central state. My third point within the second point is that citizens will then choose between competing centres of self-governance in civil society, electing to receive public services through voluntary bodies. Right. So in a sense, communities will compete by soliciting members. As communities of choice, they will aim to govern those who wish to be governed within them. And these things will be parallel, competing, and overlapping, right, with geographical spaces, okay, in complex ways. My fourth point, within my second point, is that hierarchically directed private bodies must be democratized right, and made accountable. Now, there's no easy way of doing this. Right? Don't imagine I'm suddenly going to kind of, put on a sort of bonnet rouge or something, start shouting workers' control. This is simplistic and asinine. Right? But there are many, many ways of doing this, right, of reducing hierarchy. And of course, it turns out, if we look at the modern world, that by and large, the corporations that are most effective are the ones that simulate the features of civil society, of publicity, of cooperation. Right? However false that simulation may be, right? Large numbers of Japanese workers singing the company's song, right, may not be genuine democracy, but by simulating, right, the involvement of people, their active participation, you get the results you want. Well, let's try it for real, perhaps. A determined attack upon hierarchy in civil society, far more dangerous than the tyranny of the majority. Okay. Now, the sum of these 4 points within my second point, these changes, I would call associative democracy. That is, we rely increasingly on governance for specific purposes and dimensions through civil society. People belong to many governments and circulate between them, right, as their choices and concerns change. Okay. This, of course, will be coupled with residual structures of representative democratic standard setting and control at municipal, regional, national, international levels. Okay? Because quite clearly such a system cannot operate, right, without some minimal police at its centre to maintain standards and to enforce them. Okay? So in a sense one is arguing there that yes, if government and civil society is thick and chosen by its members, if civil society is publicised, then the state really can go back to being a night watchman state, in which case, wow, the 19th and 18th century mechanisms that we devised to control it might just about work for certain purposes. Right? They will never make all the fits and joins between the different levels of government absolutely secure. There'll be slippage there all the time, but within each one of them, things will be better. Okay. My third point, then, is that the city will be less of a coherent entity. It will cede power to regional governments and to plural and competing self-governing voluntary associations within its locality, some of which stretch way beyond it. Local governments would obviously remain for certain public functions like lighting, paving, certain minimal planning controls and so on. But they will be less multidimensional and will share the space of the city with communities of choice. And these will interact with one another in complex ways, and between them individuals will circulate. Thus, there will be multiple forms and multiple spaces of publicity, communities intersecting across a far more differentiated and complex social space. And in this, in a sense, the street will merely be one place. There will be no agora, right? There will be no forum, right? There will be fora and loci, and they will shift. Okay. Now, I want to say that I think this is, of course, advocacy to some extent, what I'm saying now. But I think it fits in quite well with certain trends that are developing. Let me turn then to my model of Damascus, okay, and how this might fit in. If I can find it, that is. No, I can't. Just a minute. Let's have a look. It's somewhere in this mass of evilly organised paper. Right, yes, I have it. Okay. Now, I'm going to use the phrase Ottomanization. Right? If anybody here is Turkish, do not think that this is an insult to the Turkish empire that was. It is merely a label. Okay? When I gave an analogous lecture in the United States once, I was besieged by Turks who complained very, very loudly that this was derogatory, and I said no, it wasn't. and I did know a moderate amount about the Ottoman Empire, and actually I was saying something that I thought was in the end favourable. And then they grunted and said, oh, well, maybe, but you're the only person who's spoken about it for a long time. Do you want a drink? Right. So, I mean, it sort of went off not too badly. But I say, if anybody is of that inclination, they can buy me a drink afterwards. Okay. Now, if Western societies have been subject to a process of pluralization of social norms, division into distinct social groups, then we reach a situation, certainly in parts of the United States, where the radical divergence of ethnic, religious, and lifestyle groups has produced a kind of virtual simulation of the millet system in the Ottoman Empire, right? Where societies, city societies like Damascus, for example, were rigidly divided into quarters, right? Within which the customary law, primarily of the religious group in question, ran. Right? So within a Jewish quarter, the customary law of the Jews ran. Okay, in Christian quarter, the customary law of the Christians ran. Everybody paid taxes, and periodically had to adjust their relations to a loose and rather arbitrary form of central authority. Nevertheless, in a sense, the city jogged along. Right, it met in its marketplaces between these communities. Right? But for all purposes, it was several cities, right, each governed by their own laws. Now, if we called this process the Ottomanization of the United States, right, then one could construct a dark future scenario, right, in which common morality had worn paper thin and political power was largely divorced from the communalistic private governance of most aspects of people's lives. Now, what I want to say here is that a form of radical pluralism, right, that publicized civil society would avoid the growth of what I would call mere communalism. Okay, because I think without facing this issue, mere communalism will grow apace. Okay, in which case, what you're left with is a politics of identity, right, in which people are forced to claim a primary community identity, and the virtual absence of, if you like, public forms of check on the way that that identity is enforced. Right? These identities become communities of fate because people in them gain what I would call excessive and oppressive power over the individuals. They find it more difficult to exit. These things do become communities of fate. The different parts of the city might as well be divided by walls. Right? And all we're left with in between them are the janissaries of the LAPD firing at random. Okay? This is not a nice idea. Right? Fortunately, the LAPD seems less efficient than the janissaries. Something to be said for it. Now, if we pose that thing, what we must say, right, is the only way to cope with those problems is to both fund communities, right, encourage their democratic self-governance, and promote exit. Okay, so that people can leave them. Right? And this in particular involves improving. This is not a kind of argument of dumping the underclass. It says you must improve the position of the underclass such that they enjoy the degree of geographical and social mobility that other people have, and they can choose their own communities. That they actually have the chance of communities of choice and not of sinking into that leaven of communities of fate at the bottom that makes the city dangerous and scares everybody out of it. Okay, so I mean, this is not an argument for saying, kind of forget the streets, retire into your quarters. Right. It's saying only if we govern the city functionally, in terms of distinct communities of choice, can you have any streets back at all, in whatever spatial sense that means. Now, I would argue, therefore, that very paradoxically, the promotion of publicity in civil society, the creation of self-policing organizations, self-governing associations, right, is the salvation, right, rather than the exaggeration of these problems of plural conflict. It's because it faces these issues head on and says, no, we cannot return, to a single community. Right? We can only return, in a sense, to a thin community that we have in common. Well, what would that be? Right. The answer is, of course, that it would be a community that largely protects individuals' rights of exit from oppressive communities, right, and which stands at the extreme, right, as a barrier to communities creating unreasonable harms to others. Right? In other words, it really is a liberal night watchman state. Right? My argument would be that where you maintain enough communities of choice rather than of fate, right, where those communities rely on public funding, which is in a sense negotiated and consensual between a complex structure of forms of government and community interest, that self-interest will limit the forms of, on the one hand, conflict with other communities that the vast majority of organizations will engage in, right? And also their willingness to apply more than common social pressure to their members. Okay. Now, in which case, this system would work. Okay. It would work far better than the idea of putting back together, right, each of these communities into a simulation of the demos, okay, because they won't have it. Multiculturalism, right, through Einheitsstaat provision, will not give it. Okay. Now, what does one then say? Well, if this argument runs, it runs not merely at the local level, not merely at the level of groups in a city, right? It runs across the region, because there will be communities of interest that people join that go across regions, and of course it will run internationally. Funding there is a problem, but it's not insuperable. An international civil society has grown steadily, okay? Non-state forms of governance in the world have grown steadily. I don't think people would want to argue that elements of the international voluntary sector, right, like Oxfam or Catholic Action or something like that, right, are weak or ineffective. Very often they're effective in where states aren't and cannot be. Right? I mean, things like this, you know, will remain in Somalia long after the last Western soldier has left. And what is more, what are they doing in this country? They're working with the Somalis, who themselves see it in this way, to build associations. Somalis have realized very, very clearly, right, their state structures are dead. They must rely on creating cooperative forms of governance within localities. And this is what they're doing. Okay. Now, I use that as an extreme example, but it shows you that international agencies, part of the voluntary civil society of our world, can be very effective. Okay. Well, what's the final message of this? It is very simply, to go back to the theme of space, that you cannot put, right, a template of government over space and expect it to be neat. Right. What you're going to have, right, is a kind of utter sort of, you know, mess of overlapping lines, right? A bit like kind of, you know, one of Jeff's plans. I mean, he doesn't think that's too rude, you know. It doesn't. That sort of neat grid of political power has been sort of basically eroded into a kind of somewhat wilder, more overlapping series of positions. Well, let me leave it there in the sense that I really do think that one has to sort of look at these things not merely in terms of what one would think of architecturally, but one also has to look at the world in terms of a possible politics and realize that as the world is changing, along with ideas about architecture, you have to think of the forms of political organization that will go with them, and that is difficult because space is going to be messy. I'll stop there.
Okay, we'll take some questions. There's a question.
Describing the shift.
Shout.
Describing the shift from previous political forms to the city and the state. You mentioned the evanescence position, the move of space, place, because individuals now don't no longer live long-term in any particular way.
Right.
And you went on to describe the associative democracy, capitalism, and being very transient, pluralistic conditions. So this, I guess we're looking at a space that's no longer spatialized, and I think it's become effectively temporalized, a temporal space. And the thing that really concerns me in terms politically, in terms of what is oppressive, is not so much other groups at any level, political and economic structures, but it's change itself, the characteristics of change itself, the pace, the intensity, the degree of change, and its causes. I wonder, if space is being temporalized, I'm thinking that it's no longer political, economic, and architectural structures and infrastructures, but it's understanding change more fundamentally.
Yeah. Seems to me a very reasonable point. On the other hand, imagining that there's all this changing, wouldn't it be good if we could get back to kind of basic communities? Right. And the world has been changing for a long, long time, and things always arrive at the door of basic communities. Right. And the less they're used to a world of change and transformation and shifting around, they just get rolled over. Okay. So in the end, something arrives at the door, whatever it is, right? Whether it's plague, conquistadores, whatever it may be. Right? Usually it's the conquistadores and plague. The four horsemen generally ride together. But you cannot go back. Right? So you might as well face this thing full on. Right? Now, on the other hand, the point about temporalization, I mean, the more this thing approached the model I'm trying to describe, people have ample room to shift themselves. Okay, they're not trapped. They can change their position. They can change their group, and that gives you some flexibility in the sense that people can move quite rapidly to deal with rapid changes. Okay, I don't know if that's a kind of beginnings of an answer.
I'm interested in a whole series of writings that have tried to outline ideas of provisional organic groups with access to choice and fluidity. And yours is perhaps more subtle than some others I've read. But one question they don't ever seem to answer is they all recognize the need for accumulation of capital and access to capital, but they don't locate that. Who is in charge of guaranteeing access to capital, and who's in charge, in the broadest sense, not just money but space and material, who's in charge of the accumulation, or how is it organized? Because once you have that, then your organic groups are always operating at the generosity of that organization.
Okay. Boringly, I have constructed, for example, a welfare state on the basis of this model, okay, to try and show how people could make reasonable claims for entitlements, right, for public provision. I'm not going to kind of describe it here. I mean, it's a monomaniac idea. When Dr. Mabuse is scribbling away his final plans for world domination, I mean, you begin to feel him doing that sometimes, right? That can be done on the public side. On the side of private capital, right? I mean, I always have two answers to this. One, where does the vast bulk of capital come from? Answer, financial institutions. Where does the wealth of financial institutions come? Answer, insurance policies, pensions plans, and so on and so on and so on, ordinary citizens. Now, I think if you see the advantages of associative and mutual capital agencies, okay, mutual in the sense that they redistribute whatever gains they make to their members, okay, and that these are to a degree rooted in, I think the key locality for this is the region. Then you find the vast bulk of capital could, right, under certain circumstances, be raised by ordinary people through their savings, pension funds, insurance policies, and so on, and recycled within the region. Okay. Now, the global networks of shifting this stuff about are fragile in the extreme. Okay. and faced with the growth of such regionalisation, they can go fat. Regional institutions need to be protected. There obviously has to be a legal basis. That's not a problem. Now, I think the interesting thing about this is we frequently think that modern internationalised relationships are kind of somehow, one, new, and two, all-powerful. Okay? But they're actually incredibly vulnerable. Think about it. On significant dimensions, the world economy is less internationalised now than it was in the period between 1870 and 1914. Okay? I mean, I can quote, on monetary policy, capital flows, and so on, degree of overseas investment. Okay? What's more, that system was electronic. Right? It didn't have 500 cable channels. It didn't have satellite links in real time. But for what it did, it had submarine telegraph cables. And from 1870, those things transmitted all the market information anybody wanted. London and New York, Chicago were linked for trading as they are today for all practical purposes, not electronic sort of screens and so on, but guys in stovepipe hats, sort of with bits of paper on the floor, but nevertheless they were linked electronically. Now, that economy crashed. We know it crashed. The players in it were transformed, the financial system was transformed, the major foreign investments, particularly in Britain, were liquidated, right? And we passed through a long period from a Pax Britannica to the emergence of a Pax Americana with the Bretton Woods system and so on. But that interval was a rather grisly process. Right? Now, that shows you that this internationalized world could easily unpack. Okay? One would prefer that it unpacked by the growth, right, of regional and mutual institutions to recycle capital back into regions, thereby promoting equality. Right? I mean, why is it that most of the pensioners in northern England, right, are paying for, pension fund managers in London to make their children unemployed? Right, by shifting their money to resort hotels on the Gold Coast in Australia, or Japanese corporations. This is crazy. Okay. Sorry, I'm beginning to sound a bit like a mad old Proudhonian socialist. That's no bad thing to be. So, I mean, that's kind of my, that's my sort of answer. I mean, it really does sound a bit, kind of, get out the muskets from the cellar and storm the barricades, but it isn't like that, actually.
There's a question over there. Sorry, could you speak up?
Sorry, I wanted to pick up on the point that you made about the underclasses making their own choices. In a sense, I can't really see how the notion of people who are disenfranchised, who are living on the streets, so the homeless, people who can't handle the YTS schemes, actually fit into your role model because to simply say that we must sort of make people's lives better so that they can fit into this model is simply not good enough. There's so many people, especially now, I mean, for the last 12 years, the problem of people being disenfranchised by this government has just created a whole problem that really needs to be addressed. And I'd like to hear how your model copes with it.
Yes, certainly. It was in part designed to cope with it. Now, I mean, I think one has to say several things about the notion of an underclass. One is the model is silly because they won't stay down, they're not under. Right? They're kind of shaking it all around. Right? Secondly, they're not stupid. Okay. There's virtually no difference between most of the people who belong to the so-called underclass and most of the people in this room. Okay. One thing they badly lack is money. Right? That's not the only problem they've got. Now, if you ask the question, does one believe, I mean, forget this government, right? There's an underclass in Germany, right? Germans constantly talk about a 2/3, 1/3 society. Okay, there's an underclass in the United States. There's an underclass in Australia. right? Mrs. Thatcher, so the little Johnny Major, didn't create the underclass, right? This is an international problem. My argument goes something like this, right? One of the reasons you get an underclass is that the thing that's common between these societies, right, is not that, Ronnie Reagan runs this one, or good old Paul Keating runs that one, or little Johnny Major runs this one, right, into the ground as it happens, but never mind. It's that they have centralized bureaucratic welfare states, and that these have entered a period of impossible crisis, for all sorts of reasons which we could discuss at length. Now, the argument that I would want to put forward here are that basically much of the money that's spent on bureaucratic welfare goes straight down the drain. Right? A lot of what's offered through bureaucratic welfare is repellent to many of the people in the underclass. Okay? So the argument that I want to advance is as follows, that a mixture of the capacity to form voluntary associations, right, that can attract significant levels of funding for entitlements, right, enables two things to happen, and they have to go together. One is that campaigning voluntary associations work to help the underclass. Right. The other is that people, in inverted commas, in the underclass get the resources and the capacity to help themselves. Okay. This is a dual and mutual process. It is not private charity. It is not do-gooding. I also have to say that, as far as I know, the most effective work among the underclass is almost exclusively carried out by voluntary agencies. Right? And that neither the state nor the political parties has had much part in this. And chief among these voluntary agencies are generally the churches. These things depend on the churches. Right? Now, if that's the case, I'm a very firm believer in reinforcing success. Right? And I think, one of the few ways in which you could reinvigorate some of the most depressed and depressing areas in the country, is to give the people in it the autonomy to manage things in their own hands, not through the local council housing department, not through the welfare, not through this, not through that. Right? Now, there will be limitations with this, but the thing that we have in common throughout the Western world is the failure of bureaucratic welfare states to successfully address this problem. That's the common feature. We have similar phenomena in most of the major European and sort of Anglo-Saxon advanced countries. Okay. The one country where you don't have an underclass, it's a major European Western-style industrial country, is Japan. One of the reasons for that is there is no welfare state. Right? The results are not pleasant on the one hand because you're dependent on the family, right? And they've also been buoyed up by many, many years of more or less continuous and accelerated economic growth. But it's an interesting fact, if you want a bit of comparative analysis. Okay? There is no underclass. There are gangsters, there are untouchables, but there is no underclass in it. So, I'm not being sort of totally silly in saying this, I think, that I actually believe this is the way to go. I'm not just saying it because it's part of my argument that's got to be filled in here. I started here. Right? This is where the argument started. Right? How do you deal with its problems? How do you deal with places like the Meadowell estate? Well, not by the nanny state anymore. It's failed. It's had it. It's got to be taken away from it. People have got to get things back in their own hands.
Sorry. There was a question over there, I think. There was. Okay, Peter.
How do you engage the thought that you're expounding and setting out with the government and the realm of politics that we have at present that would be English question? No, but you're absolutely right to resist it, because I have made some representations to some people who I thought should be in this place. And one of those people, or any of his associates, was too busy, but spent but was involved this morning discussing the issue of community with Roger Scruton on a radio program. And within that sort of realm, where it was reclaiming old values versus reclaiming religion, and that's, and it was argued within that context, but broadcast. And it's how to stop that, the thinking that you're putting forward, simply being marginal. How does it engage in a political sphere and become currency?
By no single process. I mean, on the one hand, you've got to kind of say that one of the best ways of doing it is to get a number of, the more significant and active voluntary agencies to see that it provides them with elements of a political model that they can use. I mean, I've sort of tried to sort of develop this model with, for example, Anglican sort of social workers and so on. Okay. The other way is to start showing, the political parties in specific points where they can plug into this sort of thing and get benefits. Okay. I mean, the great advantage of this is that on the one hand, these different sort of levels of governance are pulling apart. The idea that there is one state that one must conquer, storming the barricades of capital, muskets in hand, is gone. So one can work by convergent strategies at different levels. But within national states, for example, convincing the political parties that it's a good idea, for example, one, to boost the voluntary sector precisely to deal with things like poverty and misery of large sections of Britain, okay, on the one hand. And on the other hand, that to promote regionalised and mutualised capital organisations might allow people in the regions to set up businesses. Right. These are ideas that you can actually sell to the political parties because they haven't got any business. They're bankrupt. Or, they're very, very interesting, not only in Britain, but I mean in Britain it's particularly spectacular, all three main political parties. If you ask them seriously how to tackle this, they haven't got a bloody clue. Right? And they're beginning to realise that, interestingly enough. Okay. And what's particularly interesting is the emergence of radical communities between the old political divisions. So look, I mean, I'm not here in a sense to kind of raise the banner of a kind of associationalist league, and sort of say this is the way forward, right? But simply to say that these arguments do have some force. Okay? People will, to a degree, listen to them.
I think just before we stop, I mean, I'd like to ask one question, which really goes back to one of the themes in Michael's book, which is that in addressing the issue of public space, and I agree with you to this extent, that it can't be the site of a sort of foundational myth of a society.
Right.
Nonetheless, it remains in its legal definition kind of an important, I mean, I think kind of vital space which ought to be protected through constitutional kind of forms.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the points that comes out in Michael's book, that in a sense, if certain functions of public space are taken over, internalized into private space in which they're then simulated,
Mm-hmm.
there is, I mean, they no longer have things like the kind of constitutional or public law protection that in a sense, when we think of things like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of movement as issues which relate to public space, those issues remain just as important even if they no longer play a foundational myth in the nature of the city, in the nature of democracy.
Yes, I mean, my book is a foil. I mean, what I'm saying is not, sorry, what I mean by that is I'm using it as a foil. I'm not criticizing the book. I think it's, incredibly stimulating and interesting. But, I mean, the point you make is to a degree, I mean, I would go along with it. The only problem, in a sense, is that if you follow the model I'm describing, right, then, you've got to think that political structures are going to look rather different. Now, one of the responses I would make to that is, in a sense, if you want then to ask the question, how do all these communities between which people circulate interact? Right. Increasingly, you have to think of different ways of doing so. Okay, you can't think of it simply in terms of public meeting places. You're also assuming that people are like reasonably able to handle information. You're starting to talk about, for example, precisely because you have 500 cable channels, okay, the creation of public information networks, telematic networks, right, that provide people with a which guide, you know, to what's available. Right. Now, actually, the French government started to develop this program, right, but it hasn't taken it very much further. I mean, I think it was an excellent idea to develop a kind of a telematic foundation for democracy in the form of open access information networks and information centres throughout the country. Okay. Some of which were walk-ins, so that if you were poor, you had access to these facilities. Right. Now, I mean, that's not to say that some of the issues you raise are not there, but I mean, imagine, for example, that you have several quite distinct cooperative shopping malls, for example, in an associationist system. Right. These places you go into and, you know, you pay with the sort of cooperative's plastic. Right. If you haven't got the cooperative's plastic, you have to sign on. Right. They aren't going to be, in that sense, public spaces. What you do want, however, is the elements of publicity between these different self-governing communities, and that can only take a kind of relatively modern form. The only form I can really see for that, in a sense, is the public funding of a large telematic database to provide you with information on this kind of thing. Okay. Now, I mean, that's almost sort of, you know, making, you know, the devil do the work of the angels. I mean, if you think of this stuff as undermining the community. But that's how I'd see it. Some of the legal defence of certain things I absolutely agree with. But you would have problems in the kind of society I'm describing. Preventing people seriously from claiming privacy. We ought to stop. But I was going to say that one thing you have to do on that is to have legal defence of inclusion and exclusion. Right. My argument is that the legal defence of inclusion and exclusion is that people can only be excluded, right, on grounds that they can choose to be excluded by. I mean, like the Church of England, you don't mind, in a sense, if, you know, you can only subscribe to, what is it, you know, 3 of the 39 articles. It's, oh, well, I won't be a Church of England minister. On the other hand, if it says, you know, no blacks, that's another matter. So associations' principles of entry have to be based on things that people themselves can choose. And if you don't like them, you don't join them. Now, that creates less problems than these things where you have business-created sort of spaces which have become the substitutes for the community, about which, you know, Michael's arguments and so on are absolutely sound. So there are issues there.
Take one more question from Raoul and then...
I want to ask you about two forms of community, and here the deal is what is the rogue community, which is the rogue community, the Viking, the robber, or the Nazi group, or some other group that actually disputes the right of a community to exist. That's one. The other one is the migrant community that exits one place, like you say, comes another place, and actually it has to displace people that are in place. Can you comment on those two?
Well, I think they're the same, actually, in the sense that, you know, the migrant community that displaces others is a rogue community. If it just comes in and settles alongside them, then, you know, providing, you know, there aren't gross conflicts over resources. People just say, well, fine, you know, there's some more people here, let's get on with it if they're semi-civilized. And they seldom are, but never mind. I mean, but the Viking community sort of thing, there's only one answer to the Viking community. You know, if it sails up your field with its axis sharp, right, you switch on the electric minefield at the entrance to the field. There has to be a legal defence of minimum good behaviour. The anti-Viking policy, yes.
I got Dago.
Coward.
But the second one, you haven't really yet answered.
Well,
because there's a difference in the sense that the migrant community still lives a dual identity.
Well, I'm not sure about this because, I mean, why doesn't it just add to the range of communities that are there? Then, you know, the problem is to try and make ways in which that work, right? I mean, there are real problems in this. And they mainly concern the possibility of individuals circulating between groups. Okay? And there's some real flashpoints in all this stuff. Right? On the other hand, the flashpoints that there are not significantly different from maintaining any kind of liberal democratic system. It's not that what I've added to the thing throws up worse problems. They're the same as any liberal democratic system would face. Okay? But, you know, I'm constitutionally averse to treating migrant communities in terms of a discourse of a problem. Right? You know, I tend to sort of think that, you know, migration is kind of providing it doesn't come, you know, in those nice ships with the funny head pieces on the front. And, you know, your kind of Flintstones model, I suppose, you know, one would be opposed to the Vicky the Viking model. Then provided it doesn't come in that form, one should support the idea of migration.
I didn't say it was a problem.
No, but, well, you posed it as if it might be. And I mean, I think the
So
way...
you're not very clear yet on how that provision that will take place and how can the system be flexible that there is the possibility for providing. You're saying, but I think this is maybe good for another time. You're simply saying it adds to the range of communities, but how precisely does it? How is the space of communities flexible enough to?
Well, why isn't it? I mean, you know, most Western societies have coped moderately well with migration. I mean, there are some that have coped badly. Well, no, they have. I mean, come on. I mean, don't. You know, there are all sorts of problems and friction, but...
But by assimilation, when the migration becomes a problem is when the assimilation model starts to break down, which is what I think Raoul's talking about.
Well, anyway, we ought to.
I think